Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. On today's episode, Bobert's back at it. Point Reyes loses ranchers, a sharktopus, and flying turtles.
Oh, we make it a laugh track this time.
Yeah, I know. I'm really excited about sharktopus and flying turtles.
Yeah, I think as long as we've got some good news in here, then it's a good news day all around.
Yeah, good. Sam, where are you?
I am in the killing fields of Wyoming, where wolves go to die and where my child is watching TV behind us. So I'm sure your editing skills can fix this, right, Mark?
Of course. Of course.
the, the
Well,
brilliant editing that you have.
the killing fields of Wyoming, I thought that wolves just naturally come down here skipping and getting baskets of food left out for them. And it's the easiest journey in the world. I don't know what you're talking about, killing fields.
Well, obviously, once you get to Colorado, we will give you a beer and welcome you to our beautiful state full of sunshine and joy. But to get here, you have to go through the predator kill zone, which is in Wyoming, where any wolf can be killed and where one of Colorado's wolves accidentally meandered across the lines and was killed by wildlife services, like we talked about before. So, Wyoming.
Yeah, well, I know that you're starting off with wolves and our favorite wolf advocate, Bobert. And when I hear her name, one of my favorite movies is Beetlejuice. And if you know Bobert, if you don't know what I'm talking about with Bobert and Beetlejuice, do a quick Google search. But you know, we've come for your daughter, Chuck. Is my favorite line from Beetlejuice. So let's proceed with some news of the day.
Well, biologist herself, Lauren Boebert, has introduced a bill that, of course, is called a Pet and Livestock Protection Bill to this Congress. It's not a new move. A lot of non-biologists have done this before, and for some reason, wolves have become a political wedge issue rather than a really cool wild species that does a lot for our environment. And it seems like this bill is getting some traction. And what this bill would do is remove wolves from the or from Federal Endangered Species Act protections and restore that power to the states. And as I understand, preemptively circumvent legal challenge should it pass. So,
Mhm.
um, very concerning. And this is concerning for a few reasons. One is that, as we know, wolves don't know state boundaries. We just talked about that a bit. Wolves in Colorado one day, maybe Wyoming wolves the next day, and Wyoming wolves one day, maybe Colorado wolves the next day. States that have similar wolf killing policies, like Idaho, their wolves also immigrate into states with wolf recovery programs where wolves haven't been restored to their natural habitat for areas of suitable habitat. Um, and then we lose the opportunity for those wolves in states where they have had healthy populations, not so much anymore now that they've killed so many of them. We lose the opportunity for those wolves' genetics to then be added to the gene pools of states like Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado. And it's a real missed opportunity for long-term recovery of the species, in addition to throwing wolf families into chaos and all of the other things that happen as soon as you delist wolves. And I think one really good example of this is that as soon as the Great Lakes wolves lost their endangered species protections, Wisconsin opened a mandated wolf hunt. And within 60 hours, hunters on snowmobiles with packs of dogs killed 30% of the wolf population of the state, 30% in 60 hours. And so more than 200 wolves dead. And all I can say is that when we look at states like Wyoming or Idaho or Montana, where wolves don't have any protections, my concern is that rather than being managed with science and rather than being managed for healthy wolf populations, and rather being recognized for their contributions to ecosystems, they're instead managed by politics and by historical hatred. And I really don't want to see this gain any traction because I don't want to see a slaughter like what happened in Wisconsin happen again.
Yeah, I watched a little bit of the hearing in Congress, and I heard this one person testify saying, well, elk are at 20% of their historical habitat, and wolves are in 20%. And that would be fine. But we don't treat those two species the same way. When if you were to list elk and then take them off, they wouldn't just immediately be decimated like you were talking about. And we can't control ourselves, and so we don't get to do these things because we haven't proved that we can be good neighbors.
Right, exactly. And in states like Montana, what we've seen is that now there's even more legislation in the state legislature to increase wolf killing even more. So they're going further. They're saying, okay, you can already use neck snares on wolves, which we know are terrible for canines, that they can live for a really long time within a snare and die a terrible death. And Carter Niemeyer had talked to us a bit about that. But they're also saying, let's not just 7 months out of the year, let's be able to kill them 10 months out of the year, including pups in their dens. And to me, that goes beyond wildlife management. That goes into the realm of cruelty. I think that people that hunt predators for fun have a very specific personality type that I would not want to be around by myself. I think that it's really concerning to see the types of quote unquote tools these guys use to kill wild animals. And we would never see this from ethical elk hunters or ethical deer hunters. If deer hunting were expanded into the season when deer had fawns, deer hunters would be outraged. They would be outraged. And the fact that we say that that's not ethical for this animal, but it's ethical for the other animal, it's really surprising to me.
Yeah, I think the big difference is that we have had generations of deer and elk hunters that have grown up with these rules, and because previously, like Dan Flores has pointed out, that elk suffered the same kinds of consequences that a lot of other species did, but we've reined in that killing, and then now it's become the norm to not kill year round and to not kill a mother with a fawn. And so we haven't had that same kind of generational gap in killing with carnivores. And so if give us 100 years of no crazy carnivore killing, and we might be able to make these rules a little bit less.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And I also think that, it's not that we haven't had these rules. We haven't had these animals restored, that we killed so many of them so effectively with poisons and with bounty programs, that to see them start to recover is new. And folks don't know how to live with that, or don't like that they didn't get to choose how or when that happened. And a lot of reasonable folks say, I just wish they weren't here. I don't see those folks as the people that are hunting wolves down with snowmobiles. I think it's a whole different activity than hunting. I think it's just all out killing, and it's pretty sadistic to me the way that folks are killing wolves. I would not see it as hunting in any sort of ethical way. And it's a framework I don't personally recognize. I think that's tough. And that's something that we should all grapple with.
I agree. But shall we save that grappling for another moment?
Yes, we can go back. We could go to more lighthearted stories now. I think that our audience will be happy that most of our stories are upbeat beyond my sad wolf plea to not delist wolves. So what you got for us? Start building us back up, Mark.
Yeah, this one's great. So this is out of California. Point Reyes settlement offers massive public and ecological benefits. So the Point Reyes National Seashore has um, traditionally had ranchers on that land, and there it's incredible habitat that has a wide range of species, from coyotes to owls to otters to elk. They all kind of wonderful species, 600 and something, I believe. And so this settlement has taken the permits away from 13 ranching families that have been using that land, and looking into, and so they're going to have 17,000 additional acres of public land. I'm a little so they're going to take barbed wire fences down, but I'm a little concerned because they're going to develop it with hiking, biking, equestrian trails and campsites and stuff, which is all great. I just hope that they keep that in moderation and don't go too wild, because just our presence out there can have a big impact on wildlife. So as much as I like getting out, let's just not overdo it right away. And so the when they made Point Reyes National Seashore, they, in today's dollars, they bought this land. The government bought this land for like $400 million in today's currency, and then the ranches that owned the land were then doing leases for pennies on the dollar. So they got all this money, and then they're using it for nothing, right? I mean, it was a pretty sweet deal that they were running for years and years, and finally, with enough public pushback, they decided that this is no longer going to happen. And so it's going to be really cool. I'm excited to see sometime. I've been close to there. It's over in the Bay Area, if you're not familiar. And I've been out. My boss lives out there in that area in like Larkspur, California, and so hopefully on my next visit out, I can make it out to Point Reyes, and I really want to see the otters out there. I mean, we love otters.
We do love otters on this podcast. Do you know
Yeah.
what we love?
What's that?
Well, I'm going to tell you what else we love, unless you had something else about Point Reyes.
Nope. That was all of my points.
Oh, wow, thanks. So we love turtles.
Yeah, of course we love turtles.
We love,
Ninja Turtles.
well, kind of.
Oh,
We love eagles.
we love eagles.
We love eagles. We love turtles.
All right, you're all over the place.
This
Come,
story,
let's focus.
this news story combines our love of both of those things.
Okay.
In a viral video, two eagles, loved and respected in the community of Redding, California, named Guardian and Liberty, have a camera that's fixed on their nest so folks can watch what they're up to and all their shenanigans. And one day, one of the two brought a sweet turtle, still alive, into the nest. And everyone was in shock. They hadn't seen the bald eagles eat turtles before. And wow, the turtle. But in a fast movement, fast for the turtle did a quick spin, as quick as turtles go, and leapt to freedom, safely to the berry bushes below the nest, all captured on the wildlife camera. So we can link to that video. The turtle refused to be eagle lunch. Guardian and Liberty had to find another meal, and the turtle is safe. So you are welcome for bringing you that news today.
That is amazing. I'll have said it once. I'll say it again. Turtles are not fast food.
Well timed, sir. Good job.
Well, I am really excited for that little turtle, and I hope that the Eagles were able to find uh, a supplement for that meal that they lost.
They did. The turtle was faster than a soaring eagle and made it to freedom from liberty.
So flying turtles, huh?
Yeah, yeah. What you got for me?
What
Beyond.
what about sharktopuses?
Do tell.
Yeah. So I rarely venture out of the US on my news stories.
Okay.
But when one reads sharktopus,
Mm,
that you go no further.
right.
That's and so one may ask, well, Mark, what is a sharktopus?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Well, Mark, do tell.
Well, a sharktopus is, of course, an octopus who has attached him or herself to the top of a short fin mako shark, and and researchers in New Zealand saw an orange bit on top of this shark. So researchers immediately took a drone, sent it up in the sky to find out what is this orange thing, and found that it was an octopus. And the curious part about it too, I mean, obviously, why is there an
Uh,
octopus on top of
I
a
think they
shark?
go pretty fast. I like that. It's like hitching a ride, but keep going.
Yeah, yeah, they went into that. So these makos, they can go, I believe it was like 30 miles an hour. It's the world's fastest shark species.
Yes.
But the octopus lives primarily deep down on the ocean floor, and the makos don't go down there. So they were wondering, well, how did this octopus find this shark? I'm thinking they're buds and they do this all the time.
Yeah.
And but just fascinating. And on a whole other, as I was looking for this story, I did also see another story. I didn't open it up, but it was talking about vocalizations by sharks. I had no
Ooh,
idea. I
vocalize?
shark shark vocalize.
Oh, wow. Well, we'll have to look into that and you'll have to feature that next week. But I'm glad they chose a mako. Octopus are so smart. And I feel like they probably saw the other sharks go slowly by and they're like, that's a lame ride. Check out this one. And now who knows where that shark's going, but he's going places.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I tell you where they're going. They're going on to Ocean's Got Talent.
Having a shark rodeo out there.
Yeah. So, it's sometimes we get a little bogged down in some sad news, but today it was nice.
It was really nice. And we were bogged down in the depths of the ocean with the wolves and like the octopus. You hitched us a ride straight to the top and I appreciate you for that. And I think we're going to have a good guest too talking about some conservation and wildlife agencies and decision making and all sorts of great stuff. So I'm
Yeah.
excited for that
Yeah.
too.
And just to forewarn people, we will go down a little bit sadder in that interview.
You
Gonna bring
know,
it down, but then we're gonna come back up.
I feel like Dr. Koontz did a really good job of showing us cracks of light. So stay tuned
That's
for
right. I think we should change our name from the Wildlife Wire to the Wildlife Wave because it's just up and down all the time.
We're just here to take you on the roller coaster that's wildlife management.
Yeah.
Yes, that's our show.
All right. Well, y'all enjoy the interview.
Welcome to Wildlife Wire, Fred Koontz. We are so excited to have you. Fred is a conservation biologist. He has served as a Washington Fish and Wildlife Commissioner, and he is now a professor emeritus, very distinguished at PanWorks. In his retirement, he stays busy. But Fred is just really brilliant at talking about all things state wildlife agencies and how we enter ethics into the conversations around decision making. And so, Fred, I'd love for you to give our listeners just a little bit of the winding road that got you here, a little background on you. And then I'd love to just pepper you with questions about state wildlife conundrums that we've all found ourselves in. So if you could start, let's let our listeners know a bit about you, Fred.
Well, I do have a long and winding road that's really led me on a journey to explore really human relationships with animals and animal ethics. It started when I got a PhD in ethology, which many of your viewers, I'm sure, or listeners know that it's the study of animal behavior, but from a natural point of view. In other words, what's the evolutionary adaptiveness of animals? Anyway, from there, I ended up working at the Bronx Zoo as curator of mammals for 10 years. And I met my wife, who's a wildlife veterinarian. So I have this kind of unusual background of having worked in a zoo and married to a wildlife veterinarian. And then I got more and more interested in international wildlife conservation. I went on to work in international conservation. So anyway, long story short, I had the opportunity to work at various kind of levels of the interaction between animals and conservation and ethics, from both um, focusing on species conservation, but then more and more caring about individual animals and how the ethics of individual animals and the idea to um, preserve animals at a species level all kind of mix. And that really comes together in today's wildlife state agencies.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting too with the zoo portion. Which species really started making you ask these kinds of questions? Was there a particular species?
Well, my wife and I had the wonderful opportunity with my job as curator and hers as a veterinarian at the zoo. We got to live in the zoo. And we also, in those days, this is like the mid 80s, we brought many of our animal subjects home to the apartment. And so which animals what I discovered is every animal is amazing. We raised in our home everything from hummingbirds to bobcats to even a sea lion in the bathtub, literally, to proboscis monkeys, pygmy marmosets, crows. I mean, everything imaginable. And every time we would say, wow, these animals are truly amazing, and they're so much more cognitive than we realized. And at the same time, remember my background was in ethology, and in the 80s and 90s, ethologists and cognitive psychologists were really beginning to grapple with, these kind of basic questions that seem almost silly to ask now. Do animals think? Do animals have feelings? Are animals conscious? And of course, over the last 40 years now, we've found the answers to all those questions, and they're yes, yes, and yes. And so then the question is, now that it's science that is really driving the change in our values that then play out on the interactions with how people treat and behave animals.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the science piece really has shown us what animals are capable of. And then the question is, how does that science become integrated in how we manage animals? And is that emerging science? And by emerging, I mean last 50 years, 100 years of science. How do we, are we integrating that in wildlife management? And what does some of that science tell us about wild animals?
Yeah, the challenge is that in some ways the science is evolving and changing faster than our ethical values in the public. And it's changing. The public wildlife values are changing, but there's sort of a historic inertia, I call it, of people's behavior. And for example, at the state wildlife agencies, their treatment of animals is still very traditional. It's like right out of the 1930s and 40s when we started managing animals for sustained use of game animals. And it's been hard culturally for these agencies and for their traditional supporters to sort of accept the changing values and how that's going to drive the purpose behind the state wildlife agencies today.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, Fred? Do you think that's from funding, or do you think it's because agencies have different values than the public? Or what are some of the reasons you think contribute to that long-standing tradition of hunting and fishing being the cornerstone of wildlife management?
I think it's because people's ethics are hard to change and adapt. And, when you think about it, where does all this come from? It really starts with your values. And so then where do your values come from? And from values comes purpose and ethics. So the values, what is it you care about? For many people, those come from their culture. And so traditional hunters, the values that they feel um, drive them and should drive the agency are cultural values. Other folks, drive their values on, what's the consequences of their actions. And then other folks just have rules that they follow. For example, the golden rule is an ethical value. So the real deeper issue is kind of where your values come from and how that drives your ethics. And then how, values are so deeply ingrained in your personality and in your experience, it's hard for people to change their values midstream. And so it's hard for the agency and the people that work there and the people that have traditionally supported them. It's hard for them to see a new way of seeing things.
Yeah, it seems like to me with such great emerging science on animal cognition and sentience and all of these things that are proving that these animals are more like us than we ever imagined. And that obviously goes against someone, say, who is a trapper and is trapping to sell pelts commercially, because now they would have to account for the individual lives of each of those animals. And so to me, it seems like a lot of it is just kind of, sticking the head in the sand. And I don't want to hear this science. And you talked a lot about values, and to me, it's just science, right? Like it's accepting the science out there that says these animals are special individuals. And so why does that get misconstrued so much into, oh, well, these are just animal lover folks, blah blah blah. And how do we get those science-based results that say that they're individuals? How do we get that to be like valued science within agencies?
Well, first of all, there's kind of two main streams of values that are causing issues in state wildlife agencies. The first one is that because of climate change and loss of species, we know that wildlife agencies need to spend more money and more effort on biodiversity conservation. For example, in Washington state, the agency's budget, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the budget is about $500 million a year, yet 5 to 10% of that is spent on non-game animals. So that's one set of values. It's science that's changing the values and the purpose of the agency. But then there's another factor that is more problematic, Mark. And that is this science is also teaching us that individual animals are aware, they are conscious. And that is very threatening to the traditionalists because they think it's a moral slippery slope. Just like the NRA talks about gun rights being a moral slippery slope, that has been probably the biggest issue. And it's the agencies. So we can find more compromise about increasing more spending for biodiversity, but the part about the individual animals is so problematic. And let me make another point, Mark, that in state wildlife agencies, all of us sort of like to think that the decisions are based on science. But no, the truth is that policy decisions, science can inform us and can tell us likely outcomes of our actions. But at the end of the day, it's really values that drive the decisions. And so it's really this kind of difficulty that the decisions, wildlife decisions, are really facts and values. And we don't have the training in the most part, the commissioners, the staff themselves. We've kind of forgotten the value of understanding philosophy and understanding, how do ethicists make decisions? We don't know how to have the conversation anymore, if we ever had it. And so we like to sort of pretend that science drives the decisions, and it really doesn't. It's really this amalgam of facts and values. And that's what I see as the biggest issue. And ultimately, those values need to inform the purpose of the agency. And we're still stuck in this very human-centric or anthropocentric viewpoint that the purpose of the agencies is to sustain the use of animals. It's right out of Gifford Pinchot and John Muir from, the 1920s. What really is the purpose of conservation?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, Fred. We had a conversation with Gary Skiba, and he had mentioned that too. And he's a career biologist as well within an agency where I science certainly can inform decisions, but it's not how decisions are made. And I think that lack of transparency on ethical decision making and the framework that agencies are using leads to all sorts of problems. That's what leads to all of this tension between wildlife agencies and the public and hunters and trappers and the public that is non-consumptive, a non-consumptive public in that framework. And then we often hear the line, follow the science. Whenever we advocate for changes or reforms that are consistent with new emerging science that maybe the agency hasn't considered, the drumbeat from the hunting and trapping crowd is follow the science, follow the science. Why are you pushing against the agency who is the keeper of the science? Do you know how we got there, or how can we get out of there? I think that those are two big questions. But how do we get out of this mess of the agency owning all of the science, but also bring forward progressive policies that aren't anti-hunting, which is something you and I and Mark have been accused of, but that actually bring the agency forward?
I think we got in this situation, you can go right back to 1935, and Aldo Leopold, who also spoke much about ethics. He also wrote a book, Wildlife Management, that became really the textbook for wildlife agencies and wildlife management, and it emphasized using science. And when he was talking about that, and then for the next, 100 years nearly, what they meant by that was use science to sustainably use the animals. In other words, maximum sustained yield, for example. And so the whole sort of science of how to maximize opportunity for hunting and harvest, that's the science that they're really talking about. So they're not talking about like ethology and the science of cognition. Science, there's just so many different questions that scientists ask and answer or provide clarity to. So we kind of got into this trap that, what science really meant was how to manage sustained use of animals. So again, it comes back to the purpose. So something interesting happened, though, in Washington State in 2008. Wolves started to naturally recolonize into Washington. And by 2011, after a great deal of public input and scientist input, a wolf management plan was produced. Okay, but what this did was there's a group of people that love wolves for wolves and their cognition and for their amazing social behavior. And so this brought, Sam, a different audience to the commission meetings to see how they were managing. And so what's happened is, how to change this. It's really most of the legislators, most of the public, they still really think the Fish and Wildlife Department is the traditional fish and game department. They think, Fred, what are you talking about? They manage the game animals and just kind of leave them alone. They're doing it in a sustained way. And yet, remember, there's these two new ideas. One, we need to do more biodiversity conservation, and we need to treat animals differently than we have in the past. And so it's just this historic legacy of what the department's purpose was. And ultimately, they have a legislative purpose, and that's really very confused and very old-fashioned in most states in the country.
Do you know if there are any state agencies that that have any biologists or ethologists that are focusing on behavior?
Yeah, yes, there are, and there's, don't get me wrong, there's many wonderful employees of state wildlife agencies, and they're changing culturally. But again, cultures change slowly. And they've broadened their science, but still primarily their science is about how to better monitor animals because they try to set harvest, They then monitor the impact of that particular harvest. They reassess it's an adaptive management framework. And so the people that they're hiring, though, many times, like in their graduate work, they did more behavior. But again, it's very small. Like in Washington State, there's 2,000 fish and wildlife employees in the department, and about 20 at the most full-time equivalents are even working on non-game. And so then it tends to be, because of the legacy of the Endangered Species Act, the non-game that they work on is really endangered species recovery. It's not about the broader conservation issues that we know we need today: ecological connectivity, more help with planning commissions on how to interact with planning and human welfare. So it's very old-fashioned science. So to answer your question, not very much is on broader kinds of issues.
Yeah, I often talk about how agencies ask the wrong question. They ask, how many can we kill without there being an issue, not how do we have the best and healthiest ecosystems. They don't even consider that. Animals are considered on a population level for how many can we kill or use for our purposes rather than how do we have the healthiest population of animals. How do we use mountain lions to best have healthy deer herds? How do we work with fish and orcas and consider orcas as stakeholders? How do we do all of that? And I think that for the public, often they think the state agency does that they consider all of these things that are natural for us to consider. And they don't consider the questions that way. And to go back to Washington, for all of its agency employees, they just hired a social scientist a couple years ago. So that's one social scientist that they've just hired to start looking at structures amongst that whole system. And most state agencies don't even have one. How do we start incorporating social science and values within state agencies, Fred? How do we start making that shift in an agency?
Well, it really is we the people. The only ways that I'd see it's really going to change is, again, in Washington, when wolves came in, that started a movement of change, really. And, um, there are cracks of light coming through. And so back to this sort of original idea of science to sustain the use of animals. Well, it didn't take very long till other factors started to come in. For example, economics. Had to have enough animals that you got enough licenses and got enough money, right? So there's a whole industry related to hunting and fishing and trapping, right? And so that sort of industry influence became right in there. But then there also was then, especially as more people got on the landscape, human wildlife conflict, right? So now, for example, elk, you not only had to manage elk to sustain them, you had to provide enough hunting opportunity that people would buy enough licenses to go out. There had to be enough success, right? Or they would stop hunting. And then the elk were raiding, especially in the winter, they were raiding farmers' land, right? So then you have to start feeding elk in the winter. So anyway, but the cracks of light, the good news is sort of like these extra components to sustaining the use of animals started to come in. And so people started to say, well, maybe maximum sustained yield isn't always the best idea. And so we started looking at, for example, optimizing more about the social factors. And then as we started to learn, and again, the Endangered Species Act, you guys are too young, but the Endangered Species Act focused all on individual species, right? And then we started to learn, like, well, you can't save the world species by species. There were too many endangered species. So then we started focusing on ecosystems. Well, this is now filtered, especially the younger employees start to say, like, well, maybe we should be managing more about ecosystem level. And for example, in Washington, there's a whole sagebrush ecosystem plan, but the science of managing the ecosystems is still secondary to managing. We're still stuck on single species management, and that is not going to meet the biodiversity needs today, let alone the animal welfare or animal well-being values that people are starting to rally around.
Yeah, as we have been talking about values and science informing decisions, I was sitting here saying, oh, but we're missing the other of the triumvirate, which is economics. And so if you were to put economics, values, and science into a pie chart on how decisions are often made at state agencies, what do you think the chart would look like?
Probably economics, because, again, the agency traditionally was funded for providing a service. And what that service was sustained yield of hunted animals and game animals. And of course, in Washington, there's one other, I can say this because I was a zoo curator, elephant in the room it is salmon, like the commercial. It isn't just hunted recreational animals. Okay. It's again economic. It's the commercial. And in Washington, salmon is king. Okay. And the amount of federal money, the amount of state money, the amount of economic benefit to Washington state that salmon has drives the political decisions hugely. It's very, very important. So again, economics uh, is really what's driving many of the failure to adapt. Now, if you really though believe in economics, what is the greatest economic factor? It's like ruining the foundation of life. Okay. So, like, again, economists have struggled to be able to show that the economic benefit of having a healthy ecosystems and having a foundation of life, which, at the end of the day, well, you two know this and your audience, most of them, I'm sure, know this, or if not all of them know this, that at the end of the day, you can't throw away the foundation of the house. It's going to collapse. And we keep kicking the can down the road. In Washington State, our new governor, Governor Ferguson, for example, has cut the $15 to $20 million that it took us years to build for biodiversity, an extra biodiversity fund for the agency. First thing to go when times get bad, pull out the biodiversity money. It's so sad. And it's because we keep failing to live up to really to the public wildlife trust responsibilities and obligations of government and of the agencies. Another thought is that in Washington, D.C., the other Washington, we're seeing the amazing disruption and the new administration is having for wildlife and for all aspects of life, really. And so we're starting to discuss more about what is the role of government. When the Trump administration canceled the U.S. aid program, we started thinking like, well, wait a minute, 1% of our budget goes to feeding literally millions of people and saving the health of millions of people, and we're not willing to do that. What is the role of our government? Well, it's the same thing in the state with what is the role of natural resource management in today's world. And that's the conversation that it's a failure, I think, of the people responsible for protecting that. That's the legislature and the governor primarily, right? And at the very end of the day, it's we, the people. We have to stand up. We have to start, just like we're demanding that U.S. aid should be started again, just as we're demanding that, Social Security should be saved. We should be demanding that natural resource management not be solely focused on the use of those animals, but we respect the intrinsic value. And we realize that at the end of the day, the biodiversity is so important because it provides the foundation of everything we do and that our children and grandchildren are going to do. And last, I would say, don't forget the animals. Protecting the wildlife trust isn't just for people, it's for all species.
Oftentimes you hear wildlife are the trust of the people in the state, and I'm always like, well, thanks, but actually they're just doing their thing. I don't, they're not here for my benefit, you know. Um, what I wanted to say though was you brought up USAID and how government organizations like that work, right? Where that's like more of a traditional type of government agency that is going to be a net on paper, it's going to be a net loss, right? We're just funneling money in, but we're wanting to do a really good thing. Where state wildlife agencies are predominantly enterprise agencies that are bringing in their own funding through the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. And so you they don't have that traditional government program for the good of the people or the environment or whatever it may be. So what would you think would be the best way? Do you think that we should shift away from that enterprise model into something that is funded in a different capacity?
That's a great question, Mark. And I've had many arguments, disagreements, maybe I should say discussions with my colleagues over that because we got into this user pay model. So many of my colleagues say like, well, we should charge for hiking equipment. We should charge a recreation fee. And I say no, because again, you're missing what the ultimate purpose of what the agency should be. It should be talk more about health, human health, wildlife health. Who should pay for that? We, the people, should pay for that. And, I'm sorry. That's the way, that's the way it is. The whole reason to have government and society is the governments are not businesses. Okay. Governments are to provide activities, to provide work that we need to have the kind of society that we want to have. You know, education, transportation, all these things really are group efforts of society and protecting the environment. It's not about hunting and angling and bird watching. It's about protecting biodiversity that's needed to have a healthy life, to have a sustainable life, to have economies. It's about all that we need. And so it should be paid for by all, you know, is how I believe. And that's a big disagreement among the conservation community.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we all discuss frequently. And I would say it's beyond a protection, it's an investment. When
Yeah.
we look at our children now, how do we invest in the environment in a way that's best for their futures so it's still there? And again, it is all people should be investing in that. In states like Missouri, where they have a universal, a sales tax that funds their agency, we see more values aligned decision making between the people and the agency. Do you see that as part of the solution? And I know other state agencies like Washington's funding, now majority of that funding comes from the legislature. It doesn't come from hunting and fishing licenses. Colorado's different. The majority of our funding comes from out of state elk tags. Each state's a little different. But when you look at that Missouri model, do you think that that's probably our best solution?
Well, I guess we're in a transition and, maybe I should be more realistic politically and think about things like that, where there could be like real estate transfer taxes and that sort of thing. But again, ultimately, it's about the purpose. And ultimately, it's about the legislative purpose. And then we put in writing very clearly the kinds of activities that the agency should be doing. And once you clearly define the purpose, then you can define, well, who should pay for that? And then you can decide how to pay for that. Also, one thing to know in Washington, 110 million out of that 500 million comes from the federal government because of salmon. And what it is when we dammed up the Columbia River to make power, the Bonneville administration, the Bonneville Power Administration had to pay mitigation. Sadly, the mitigation is fish hatcheries, which we know are not really the ultimate direction we want to go to try to sustain salmon in the long run, rather than fixing the habitat, for example, and better monitoring the harvest and hoping climate change doesn't doom us all.
Wow, that was a bright spot there.
Yeah, I know. I've been known as a little bit negative. I'm trying to be positive here. And I told you there was cracks of light coming through. Okay, so hang in there, Sam and Mark. It's coming. But again, I'm like a tired record here, Mark. But it really is about engaging people to basically push the legislators that no, just stop it. Like get the adults in the room, decide what the purpose is, and figure out because it is really about our children. When I became a commissioner on my first day, I introduced myself, and I, I didn't go over big, but I said like many of you are here to represent the hunting interests, other people conservation interests. I'm here to represent the child being born today and what they would want our decisions to be. And, everybody kind of looked at me like, "Oh, gee, Fred, get off your soapbox." But really that's the reality, right? It's like protecting the future by what we do today. And then who pays for the future? Like stop being greedy, like grow up, be an adult and realize that, that's our responsibility. It's not just about, what we get out of it. It's about it's an opportunity, right? Here's the positive part. We have an opportunity to protect the future. I mean, what a legacy for all of us. It's incredible. It gives you purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one last question I have is let's say we're trying to get the people together and the people in the room. What's the story we should be telling people to get them engaged now? What is the message to, let's say, the mom that's working full time and's got 3 kids and likes that wildlife exists, but doesn't know anything about state agencies? What's the message that we deliver to get those people engaged and caring?
It's funny sometimes when I give my talks, okay, everybody now knows I sometimes get a little negative. So what tends to happen is in the social hour, somebody will pull me to the side and they'll say, "Fred, is it really that bad? Are these endangered species? Is it really that important?" And I say, "Yes, it really is. 30% of the amphibians are endangered and basically 30% of everything is endangered. And this is also super important to know. Not only are species endangered, but we're losing the abundances of animals. And in some ways, that's probably more important because when you think about it, each animal brings a certain benefit to the world, right? And it's really a per capita benefit. So again, think about honeybees because it's kind of easy to think about. Each bee produces so many pollination services, and so that adds up. So the fact that we're losing 1 or 2% of the wild bees a year, it doesn't take that long until we're in a crisis situation. So what's to get them there? Okay, well, first of all, that we really are running out of time. But again, I think turning it that this is something everybody can engage in to find purpose in your own life. I mean, I go to legislators, I say, like, don't you want a legacy? Don't you want to have made a difference? And this is like just a wonderful opportunity to be able to be part of the solution. I think especially for young people, there's actually nothing more exciting than being part of a revolution. Okay. And making it, I mean, that's really exciting. Get out in the street, protest, make a difference, get the legislators to change and write a bill. And first of all, it's easier to do than you think. I'm amazed at how many legislators just welcome it when you actually even draft the legislation for them. It's like, are you kidding me? It's like incredible. So young people, especially, this is like really exciting thing to do is to get engaged in making a difference and helping to save the planet. I mean, what could be more fun than that?
I
Yeah.
agree. I took my daughter to see Bernie Sanders and AOC the
Ah,
other day.
super.
There was 34,000 people at downtown Denver, and she was like, whatever. I was like, one day you'll look back and say, wow, that was awesome that I was there with my parents. But yeah, I digress. And Sam, I would love for you to have any final thoughts here. And Fred, I appreciate you.
Fred, I think you did a great job with Cracks of Life this time. I appreciate it. And no, I think that optimism is so important. And that's really, the hope of Mark and I with our work and with this podcast is getting the people to show up, getting them to know that there's a problem, but getting them to know there's a solution. We can all engage in this work. This is your wildlife agency as much as it's our wildlife agency, as much as it's, the predator hunters and trappers agency. And I think that when people know that and they feel empowered to engage will see a difference. And I'm thrilled that you were able to talk through that with us a bit, Fred. Can you tell people where they can find some of your ethical work? Is it through PanWorks? How can folks find the work you're doing online?
There's a website, PanWorks, and if you just go to Google or whatever browser searcher you use and put in PanWorks, you'll find it. And it's a think tank really dedicated to the ethical well-being of animals, and it's an interesting group of people that participate. It's international. We have folks from Germany, England, Australia, and we also do a podcast ourselves from time to time. And I encourage you to start thinking a little bit more about ethics and reading some of the great philosophers. If I can give one tip, to look up Mary Midgley, Midgley, and she's passed away, but she has written some tremendously valuable philosophy books about helping to bridge philosophy to help in developing animal ethics and really creating what Mary would call a community of life. And I think that's what we're all really striving to do. And I appreciate Wildwire and what you two are doing. And my advice as an older person is keep it up.
Well, we'll keep the resistance going. Thank you, Fred. We appreciate you. And thanks for joining the pod today.
My pleasure.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.